I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Jeanine Canty. Jeanine is a professor of transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. A lover of nature, justice, and contemplative practice, her teaching intersects issues of social and ecological justice, eco-psychology, and the process of worldview expansion and change. She is both editor and contributor to the books Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices, and Globalization and Localization, Emergent Approaches to Ecological and Social Crises. Her forthcoming book is Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism and Healing Our Planet. So delighted that you're here. I am really just going to dive in.
Sure. And hopefully I have some interesting responses.
I'm sure you will. So you've said that racism isn't about people not liking other people. It's about acquisition of resources. Will you share about this misunderstanding, specifically the time in history when we started to see the gifts of our earth as resources and the relationship between that perspective and the ways we related with our human family, how that changed simultaneously?
Early in my studies, even as a young woman, I was very, very affected by racism. I identify as a woman of color, multicultural, but primarily identify as African American or Black, multiracial. And I had a lot of really painful experiences with racism as a child, particularly my parents moved my brother and I out of New York City into like an all-white suburb of New Jersey in the 70s when, I was just a baby. But so I got a lot of firsthand experiences with that. So it was always a thread throughout my life that I was really curious about how racism works. So I did actually a lot of unlearning, decoupling, decolonizing that process in terms of multicultural education and just learning about social injustices. And then at a certain point, I had gone back to school and I was doing a 2-year teacher education program. But I was also started during that program looking at the field of eco-psychology. So I was studying those simultaneously. And I had some great mentors, particularly a woman named Belvy Rooks and a man named Carl Anthony. They're both in the Bay Area. The coalition of those kind of intersectionalities of those issues, I realized that one of the goals of social justice education is to eliminate racism. So we have a quote unquote free society. But then if you look at it, the bigger piece that if all marginalized, quote unquote, marginalized populations in the US were liberated, it would really just be liberating us to extend the American, quote unquote, American dream to the global South and other marginalized communities across the globe. So really giving us freedom to have a lot of injustice. And so that's where it really clicked for me, how I talk about how the oppression of the earth and oppression of people go hand in hand. And we get the story that racism is about certain people not liking certain people and kind of this hierarchy. There's bias and judgments and assumptions and racism, but racism is really an institutional piece. And then it's deeply linked with our economic system. Every large-scale pattern of racism is always about the acquisition of resources, including people, labor. And so I looked specifically at, there's this term, academic named Frederick Yeo talks about these caste-like immigrants. And so really looking at Native Americans, African Americans, some Latino Chicana populations, and also some Asian American populations as folks that didn't choose to come to the US, and how when I look at those four different groups and their stories, with Native Americans, you can really see how they were already here, and the racism that occurred and is still occurring was really initially based on taking land. This principle in the kind of Western ideology of terra nullius or terra nullius, of this Turtle Island, what is the boundaries of America, what we call it, or the US, free land, empty for the taking. And in order to do that, they had to silence and oppress Native Americans. And then similarly with African Americans that are descended from enslavement, they were forced here, stolen from their communities in order to work the land. And so again, it's about acquisition of natural resources. A similar story for Chicana Americans who were here before colonization happened. Similar story that happened to Native Americans, that their lands were taken. There's a horrible historical story of when we need free and cheap labor, borders become open, and when we don't, they become closed. And just looking at that, people don't realize that when slavery was made illegal, a lot of the former slave ships were actually used to bring Asian American populations to the US and the Americas in general, again, to work the land. And so looking at that story, and so the connection between that, and when we look at racism, we have to look at the deeper story within that. And we can even go deeper for folks that are descended from Europeans, looking at the witch burnings, which was basically divesting pagan, earth-based, small farming communities in Europe from their land by the church and state. So again, acquisition of land, and also then forcing people in the global marketplace to work for them.
As you bring up our history with the way we've treated pagan traditions, how has organized religion played a role in globalization and this kind of disconnecting us from interconnection?
Yeah, and that's such a big area. I guess in a more simplistic narration of it, we saw a time period where suddenly a lot of earth-based traditions were disrupted, and we were moved into, I always bring up the work of Chalice Glendinning, and others bring this up in their work as well, but she's got a great book called My Name is Chalice and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization. And she talks about the root of our disconnection from nature happened through the process of domestication, the instances where we stopped being hunter-gatherers and started staying in one place. And that spiraled into a whole chain of different things, including when we're living in one place, suddenly population escalates. And when you start having bigger and bigger populations, suddenly you need not only the land that you have in your community, but you need someone else, your neighbor's land, or then you need to travel far distances to find your spices or whatever you're looking for. And with that, there was kind of a need for a narrative that was controlling the dominant worldview. So this establishment of a more global worldview and also just control of these larger populations. And so we saw a rise in what we would call now like policing forces, military, and then also the role of the state, and which was the same time period as the rise of large-scale religions. And what was interesting with kind of the church and other large-scale religions, suddenly people, instead of having a firsthand connection to nature within their bioregions, with their community, they were receiving authority from a pulpit, a religious figure, later on from a book for those who could actually read or hear what was in the book. And so people lost this sacred relationship of being able to have a personal relationship with what's divine and sacred rather than having it mediated through an authority figure. So I often talk about what I would call suitcase religions, like religions that you can just take with you anywhere. While can be precious practices, and I'm not anti-religion per se, but yet having this personal sacred relationship with the divine in your bioregion is so precious.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Back to this piece of the importance of working with social activism and environmental together. That's something that you've shared, the significance, how we seem to want to work with them separately, but the importance of tandem.
I mean, I love both the social justice movements and environmental movements and feel like they're so important. But at a certain point, I get disenchanted when we're the environmental movement. There's been a lot of critique over the last several decades about how the movement itself often appears as something for privileged white people, and who's an environmentalist. Often people don't, more and more people are learning about environmental justice and climate justice, but realizing that it's actually people of color, indigenous people, women, children, and people with varying abilities and that are actually disproportionately affected by ecological issues. And I'll even extend that to LGBTQ communities as well. But really marginalized populations are disproportionately affected by ecological issues because they have less political and often less economic power to fight these issues, and also to have a stake in how they're attended to. I talk often about, I live outside of Boulder, Colorado, and Boulder is a very white, affluent community, and if some sort of environmental toxic industry comes in, we all get into costumes, get on our bikes with some signs and do a little protesting, call our local politicians, and then it's not an issue because that that initiative's moved somewhere else. And often we don't realize where that company may go. And there's this term in environmental justice called NIMBY, and not in my backyard. And so if it's not here, that away is in someone else's community. And often those communities don't have the same privileges in order to fight those communities. And often those communities actually need those jobs. So there's another term called jobs versus environment, where people have to make the choice often whether they want a paycheck or they want healthy water or non-toxic work conditions, which isn't a choice that anyone should make. Yeah, and so I think that's kind of the crux of it with environmental issues, environmental justice. And then when we go back to social justice and like multicultural education or just any initiative that's just focused on people of color or a certain community, but doesn't look at the larger issues that are going on the planet. And what does it matter if we all have freedom if the planet is dying? So our liberation is not only bound up with one another, it's bound up with all Earth's life systems. And so, yeah, we just need to attend to that. So, yeah, that freedom to, what I was saying before, we don't want freedom to pursue unbridled capitalism, although maybe some people do. That's not what I'm into. I want the wellness of all beings. So it's so important to tie those things together. And we're still, even though intersectionality is so big within the social justice world, it's usually intersectionality around multiple identities, racial identities, social positionalities or maybe gender and sexuality and abilities, but we're not talking about all living beings and attending to the more than human world.
So you speak about this tendency to refer to wholeness as the ideal and brokenness as the barrier. And you write, and this is your quote, "If we are to collectively transition to sustainable relationships, all peoples must become indigenous to place. Learning about local ecosystems, learning from the peoples native to place, and drastically changing our patterns of consumption and worldviews are all a part of this time. It's not enough to return to what was indigenous in the past. We must honor our stories of brokenness, reweave our various and disparate experiences to our present relationships with place, including one another." End of quote. What does this look like for someone to honor brokenness, to reweave our various and disparate experiences? Will you share on the breadth and knowledge that comes of brokenness and this simply not trying to remake indigenous histories while also honoring them?
Yeah, and let me see if I can fully attend to that. First, in terms of that piece, a lot of it was the juxtapositions between the connections with healing and the juxtaposition between wholeness and brokenness. And often there's this, oh, everyone can be whole again. And while I believe that, I feel like there's even more power in actually tapping into the wisdom of our brokenness, and even looking at our, in particular, our broken identities. And that idea, and this actually comes again from that book I was just talking about from Chalice Glendinning. She talks about, and so many eco-psychologists and psychologists in general talk about how anyone living in our current world, and with eco-psychology, it's particularly under the kind of Western paradigm, and I extend that to any culture, community that's living under corporate globalization, which unfortunately is so many communities, that essentially we're all traumatized. And so it doesn't matter if you're making millions or billions or whatever your economic reality is, everyone under the system is holding trauma and also enacting trauma. And when we can actually start awakening to our stories of trauma, and both kind of the history, her story, their story, that interweaves that and how that plays out in the present, there's something really powerful of seeing various threads of brokenness come together. So they weave together, and they're not necessarily just the same thing. We all have such diverse yet interconnected patterns, no matter what our heritage and social locations are. But there's something about, and in particular, I looked at my own kind of enculturations and waking up to that story of how I've always straddled kind of multiple identities, multiple social locations, multiple like bioregions. And so sometimes I call it like walking between worlds, and how when we can recognize kind of the cross sections, these liminal spaces that we inhabit, especially people that have these kind of multiple identities, and in a good way, it's actually where a lot of the sustenance for healing is coming out of, because we're not situated in one worldview, because we've always had to straddle multiple worldviews. And that sense of liminality in permaculture, there's this whole idea of like when edges come together, there's often in that ecozone, that overlapping ecozone, things that wouldn't actually grow there in either other ecozone grow in this. I think that quote comes from this book I put together called Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices. And all of the women, most of them are women of color, and all of us had some sort of combination of addressing both social justice and ecological issues. And I was really interested in what was coming out of that. And there were a number of indigenous women that contributed to that book. One of the contributors is a woman named Dr. Melissa Nelson, and she actually put together this great book that brings together all of these oral talks by indigenous folks that are working around ecological issues that are fairly well known. And I forget which one, but I think a number of people just talk about this need for indigeneity, and not just for indigenous folks, Native American and other indigenous folks around the world reclaiming their indigeneity, which is so important and upfront, but also that if we're really going to be addressing and healing the ecological crisis, we actually all need to become bonded and in relationships with our ecosystems in respectful ways. So whether it's earth citizens or just indigenous to places. And it doesn't mean taking the traditional knowledge of the people that live on this land, indigenous peoples. And I should do just land acknowledgement that I live on the ancestral lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples, where I live in Colorado. And so it's not about taking that knowledge or anyone taking the knowledge of those traditions of where you actually live, but actually becoming home to place. So I love that there's a song from, it's probably a colonized story, but The King and I, but there's a song, it's like getting to know you, getting to know. So I always think about that when I'm teaching and working with people, connecting with them with the natural world, because you just kind of start dating. You're starting to like, oh, who lives here? And I wonder if they like me. I hope they like me. How can I be respectful? What time does the sun come up this time of year? And where does it set? And how are we oriented? Where's the water? What trees live here? What are there any big animals? Who are the birds? What grows here? Just all of that. And not only the more than human world, but do you know your neighbors? I have the deep honor of living in a small community where we've had floods and where the roads are washed out, fires where we're evacuated for days, and big snowstorms. And so we have a small community and we know each other. And I know where a lot of my neighbors keep their keys in case of emergencies. I know their pets' names and vice versa. And so, and similar of knowing who the local businesses are, who's actually growing food and different things that you can just really, and it doesn't mean that I don't actually still purchase in the global marketplace, but I try as much as possible to attend to place and home and learn how to become indigenous to my place without cultural appropriating, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's so helpful. I would love to get into these terms that you speak of, this narcissistic self, the transition from the narcissistic self to the ecological self. And could you share about the definitions of both this narcissistic kind of self-interested self, as well as this relational, fluid, ecological self, as well as just some of the causes of becoming a narcissistic?
Oh, yes. I laugh too, because I have to plug, I have a book that's coming out in September, and it's available for pre-order, but it's called, what is it called? Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism and Healing the Planet. But I always laugh because just even promoting self and not to be overly narcissistic, but yeah, there's this whole, there's so much in terms of the narcissism of our times. And in the last decade or so, we have this kind of meme of everyone's a narcissist, and some political leaders that seem to display these extreme narcissist traits, not to name anyone particular, but and there's this kind of piece where we like to point at others as narcissists. But I was really interested in looking at our collective narcissism. And narcissism, and kind of a glib definition, is when someone is extremely self-centered, just really, you can, it's like you have that person in your life that whenever you start having a conversation, quote unquote, they immediately, if you start sharing about yourself, they cut you off and redirect the conversation back to them. And so that's like a little taste of it. But there's actually, well, first of all, it's everyone should have a little bit of narcissism. We want healthy narcissism, which a lot of therapists and psychologists will talk about. But then there's kind of a range, a scale of narcissism. And when you're really on the upper scale and you're so self-consumed, it becomes a problem. And then there's also a clinical diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, where someone is just so extremely self-focused that they have really entitlement, overblown ego, very fragile ego, and they can be very combative, have very little self-awareness. Everything revolves around them. It's every day is my birthday because I'm so special, and just extreme entitlement. And if you've ever encountered someone, and it's very hard to diagnose anyone with narcissistic personality, and only a licensed therapist can do so. And even someone who's licensed, it's really hard to do. And so I'm not really focused on individuals, but I was more interested in looking at this kind of collective narcissism that has swept our society. And we see it so much in the constant social media posting every hour, every day. Look at me, look at my selfie, look how special I am. And just everything revolves around me. And it's really sad. And then when you look at extreme narcissists and people with narcissistic personality disorder, it's actually this deep wound of not having healthy early caregivers that left an intact sense of belonging, a unique identity, just kind of self-actualization and feeling trust and safety. And so when that's not provided, someone who's wounded in that way often needs to create this false self-narrative to protect themselves, but it becomes really problematic. And when we go back to this idea that we're all traumatized, we can see how so many folks within our society, based on the way society has treated us so poorly in terms of creating all of these external false needs, like I need to look a certain way, I need to date and marry the right person, I need to have the right type of home and the right job, I need to be the right body type, and all of these great grades and lots of ribbons and awards and baubles or whatever all of that is. So we can spend so much of our lifetime trying to please the outward world instead of developing this rich inner kind of transpersonal self, and also this going back to really having these deep, beautiful bonds with place and nature and our community. And when we're stuck in a narcissistic paradigm, we have such little compassion for other humans and such little awareness and compassion for the more than human world that it really fosters the destruction that we're doing towards the planet and ourselves. And that really relates a lot to the work that I do with eco-psychology. And so part of the kind of the ego self in a narcissistic paradigm, when we go into eco-psychology and deep ecology and these other paradigms, there's this term called the ecological self. And that's what we were talking about earlier, getting to know you, that when we actually spend time in relationship with places, with melting snow or the beautiful tree outside, or just even I have a big dog right next to me that you can't see, but just, and birds and all of beings in our place, we actually start realizing that our identity is bound up with the identity of another being. Like we start feeling like love. It's like those moments, like I'm sure everyone who's listening has had that moment where you're sitting outside and you hear like a bird near you, like singing. So you call back and then suddenly the bird calls back and then suddenly you're in this 10-minute conversation and it's like, wow, that's so cool. We're talking. I'm not sure exactly what we're saying, but we're communicating. And then you feel like, oh, I'm kind of smitten with this bird. And then you have certain places that maybe you walk, or ponds or creeks or rivers, and you just start having these relationships. So yourself is actually expanded. So you're not like, often in the ego paradigm, we think it's like I think and therefore I am, Descartes, and it's like we're these talking heads. But when we actually learn to not only tap into our bodies, but our sensory awareness, relationships with the natural world, our self starts expanding, and we realize that, yeah, we're so connected, and our boundaries of who we are tied up in the destiny of others. And so it's really learning this love and capacity.
Really appreciate that explanation. Mm-hmm. The transition from the two, the looking out and getting to know, seems like the transition from what you're saying, from the narcissistic to the ecological self.
Yeah. And someone who is diagnosed with narcissism or undiagnosed but has narcissistic personality, that can be really challenging. But most of us do not have this. We're just living under narcissistic meme. So we actually have so much capacity to start tapping into our innate qualities for deep connection, and to stop being so self-focused, and to both turn in and turn out at the same time. And what's so nice about it is, like, first we have such fewer, when we're spending time with other people and with nature and doing inner work, we're probably not like shopping or causing just harm and destruction to others. And then, like, that's a beautiful thing. And then we also learn like what like contentment really is. I think there's so much like loneliness and alienation and things of what's the purpose right now, but we actually find so much richness and depth. And the most folks will talk about finding the non-ordinary experiences which become extraordinary. So when we sit in outside in like really warm sunlight and feel like that envelope of that warmth and connection, it's like a really sacred moment that we start looking better because we're getting some sunlight and hopefully clean air and some peacefulness. And then we're also not doing all these kind of negative things. And so we can actually, like, it's a practice of, even in every moment, or more and more moments, of catching like what's the beauty of this moment. And even in like the really painful moments. Similarly, I remember years and years ago, I was going through a breakup, and I was out on my porch, and I was just crying and like really sad, and had the wall of tears, and all of a sudden a bird came by, and I just remember looking up and being like, that bird is so beautiful. And so like we can even inhabit the spaces of really deep suffering. And maybe a breakup's not the deepest suffering, but even like the death of a loved one or witnessing a kind of catastrophe in a community, yet seeing the beauty of like people showing up and coming together, and beauty in every moment if we can. And it doesn't mean we have to find the beauty in every moment, but we can at least find multiple moments each day.
I like that you bring that in, because I think there can be this thought that if one were to see the beauty in the suffering, they would be discounting the suffering.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's so kind of binary in our like cultural conditioning, that like the bad has to be all bad and the good has to be all good. But yeah, and there is, I think, maybe our influences with like positive psychology and people just wanting to focus on the good energy. But even if I have a stretch of just really a lot of good, I start getting a little like nervous, because I feel like it all goes in waves, and I'd rather have like daily balance and be able to attend to what's really happening, rather than, again, and that's part of the trait of narcissism, is creating like a fictitious great reality. And no matter how much healing we do, the healing is about the balance. And so the pain is always going to be around. We just don't need to cause unnecessarily pain to others. And I definitely am heavily influenced by some more mainstream and not so mainstream Buddhist ideals, and just really recognizing that there will always be suffering in the world, yet there will always be beauty in the world and joy in the world, and so many other ranges. And just so much of the point is to attend to this life, because who knows, this could be our only life in a physical body in this moment. Getting all these, like, every day I'm like, oh my God, it's so crazy that like I feel really thankful that I have the ability to use all of my sensory awarenesses, and I can go outside. And I don't want to marginalize someone who doesn't have access to certain abilities, because everyone has access to some ability, but it's just amazing. I'm like, this is crazy. Like, I am talking and you can hear me. Where like I was drinking water before and it goes in my body, and these things that are like, duh, Jeanine, but I'm like, duh, this is so cool.
Yes, we're all going to drink our water differently after this conversation. It's so true, though. The amazing shift in perspective of a simple act of experience of that connection. And I actually also really like you talk about this multiple worldview. And it's really hard for us, like this time in the world. I've never seen it more in my lifetime, the difficulty for us humans to hold multiple worldviews at once. So you really, really see it right now, the divisions and the judgment we hold and distance we're keeping with people that hold different worldviews. And could you share about the notion of the multicultural self, as well as the significance of moving through crisis as a means to allow to hold multiple worldviews?
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. The first kind of introduction to that, I have one of my mentors. He's a fairly famous environmental justice scholar, activist, leader, and also an urban architect, Carl Anthony. And he had this essay in a really early eco-psychology book, and he was being interviewed by Theodore Roszak about just connections between race and eco-psychology. And so he introduced just this idea of, we don't learn the stories of the people in our community. Like in our schooling, we're learning about like the pilgrims and the founding fathers and a lot of European history, but we don't actually know the real stories of like normal people's lineage that we like cohabitate with. And with my work because I was doing a lot of work with eco-psychology and also multicultural education at the same time, and studying and also teaching in these areas. And I realized that a lot of the reasons, the kind of trajectory of unlearning both ecological unawareness and also waking up to racism and other forms of social injustice were the same processes. And just as we have this ecological self, this multicultural self that Carl Anthony was talking about, the stories of other people, is that ability to extend our worldviews. And I was really influenced. A dear friend and colleague, my friend Vicki Young, introduced me to the work of Milton Bennett, and he's got this framework called intercultural sensitivity, saying it wrong, but it was basically like this work, the spectrum of how people become more resilient, going from like denial, defense, minimization to finally acceptance. And then in the latter stages is, that's where I use that term, kind of walking between worlds, both with ecological and social justice issues, is that like when you befriend that tree or that bird, you start extending your ecological self. And then with a multicultural self, when you start talking to someone from a different social location, a different economic position, a different racial or cultural identity, a different political affiliation, even gender, sexuality, all of those things, that we start to understand their story in such a way that when we again see that we're connected, we start to bond, and we realize that our destinies are bound up with one another. And then when we can actually do that with more than one person, I can, quote unquote, I'll never fully be able to walk in someone else's shoes, but I can start understanding. And then I can learn how to do that with lots of different identities. I may not be in that identity, but at least I can have some sort of understanding. And so then we start being able to almost like shape shift, and in such a way that our original worldview and identity is like kind of blown out, and it's still there, but it's so expanded that, yeah, you're kind of just walking between multiple worlds. And I think that holds true not just with connecting with humans or animals and other beings and spaces in the natural world, but that also happens when we have what's called this transpersonal self, when we start connecting with maybe unseen aspects of the living world, or where we start just really feeling like wisdom and guidance from places that aren't necessarily pinpointable, but we feel it and even hear it or dream it, or whatever forms it comes into. And I mean, the best part of it is like in Western paradigms, we have so much pressure on, I need to heal, I need to carry this project forward, I need to be the, savior, the superhero. But when we actually can like surrender, and I talk a lot about just grace, and when we can surrender to this grace that's all around us, of us not needing to have all the answers, know the exact pathway. We have all these allies, both in the non-human world and the human world, and in a world we don't even kind of know exists. And when we can surrender to that, suddenly we get this crazy amounts of like insights and power and guidance. And I don't know how it works, but like it works. And this is great. I laugh sometimes. I notice if I write a to-do list out versus if I don't, right? Somehow like I'm like, I don't know who did that to-do list, but it got done. Like, I have these helpers, I don't know who's helping, but thank you. Thank you.
Totally.
Well, one of my deepest, not really, but I always laugh. I don't know why my dog can't just learn how to do house cleaning.
Little do you know when you're asleep at night.
Right. Totally.
I mean, I guess my question too is, do you feel, just kind of in line with what you're sharing right now, do you feel like there's a way to shift out of these conditioned states without effort, without choice? Or is it something that we must choose, we
Yeah,
must put effort towards?
I think we have to choose it. I mean, sometimes maybe we don't even know that we're choosing it. I mean, I feel like I had like questions and I had like intentions, but I didn't really know how that was all going to work. And then all of a sudden I got flooded with, I've been so blessed to have really wonderful mentors throughout my life, like people who saw me and wanted to help me, both in and out of my family, both in and out of my like cultural identities. And then same thing, it's not just about the one-on-one relationships, but I've been in so many communities of folks that are like doing really creative, cool things, and they're all different types of communities. But I definitely believe like this, when we let ourselves move from into the collective rather from the individual, it happens. There's the intention or like putting it out there a little bit and then it'll come. But there's also just practice. It requires, I think, once we start putting in effort, all of a sudden results come. And it doesn't mean that we're not like overthrown with lots of threshold demons along the way that can kind of toss us back into like states of despair and not wanting to do things and apathy. But if we really practice, so like for me, a lot of the practice was learning how to meditate, to kind of get a hold on regulating my thoughts and maybe quieting my thoughts a bit. Same thing with spending time in nature. Same thing. It was just like so many different practices, and also putting time into my studies, putting time into my relationships, putting a lot of time into ecological efforts of trying to reduce my consumption or being aware of the things that I consume, where they come from, and making hopefully some tougher decisions about that, and creative decisions as well. And I'm by no means some ecological sage living off the grid. I mean, I definitely, I know so many aspects of my lifestyle are harming still. I drive a vehicle, I fly on planes, I will still order certain things that come in boxes and have plastic, but I keep trying to double down on my commitments and also doing the work that I feel I'm called to do to make changes. So yeah, I think intention, a lot of effort, but also just a lot of I feel like it's all about relationship.
Will you just say a little bit more about that piece?
Sometimes like I have a PhD and I've been a professor for a long time and I write books and stuff. And so someone might, oh, you're really smart or something. And I'm like, I'm actually not. I mean, not to disclaim, but I feel like my smartness is more about being present and attending and being and listening and encouraging and creating with others. And like everything I know and who I am is so dependent on all of the relationships I've had. I'm starting with like my ancestors and then with earth and with I'm so blessed. I have so many friends, like really great friends that I've had for decades, and community members and the educational community, so many different pieces. And then I mentioned the mentors and my parents and my aunts and uncles and cousins, just all of these people and all of these beings in the world that have just really helped me. And so it's like same thing when we're talking about the ecological self, the multicultural self, and the transpersonal self. And suddenly knowledge and gifts aren't contained within our just our head or just our body, that it's actually a landscape that we tap into, and so much of it is actually shared knowledge. So I'm not owning any like bit of knowledge. I mean, there's certain things that I'm good at bringing together, but it's already all out there. And so learning how to do that. And then I think it's Derek Jensen, he talks about in one of his books, would you rather have a friend that can cite a zillion factoids, or would you rather have a friend that can watch the gestures in your body and know how you're feeling? The real like currency is about a relational currency, and we're living in a world where that hasn't necessarily been fostered. Yet we're in this great, as Joanna Macy and David Corton and others talk about, this great turning. Now we're really tapping back into this relational awareness. And you were talking before about the division and the polarization in our, not only the US, like worldwide right now. And people are so afraid and angry at, the other. Yet underneath that, I mean, I truly believe there's like a lot of alienation and deep longing for love and connection. And yeah, I'm definitely not really a strong supporter of like decolonization. I also don't want to silence anyone. I want to live in a society where Starhawk has a great book. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's The Fifth Sacred Thing. It's a fiction book, but one of her like key through lines is that there's a place at the table for you if you'll join us. And just so having this like story that has a place for the well-being of all beings, not just beings of a certain color or beings of a certain political affiliation or beings that are doing this one practice, and that we need to stop like othering and demonizing one another, even the folks that we might have the most like anger at when we're decolonizing. And so just, going back to like love and relationship, compassion. And part of that is like conflict. Conflict's going to happen, and we need to be better at engaging it in conflict without then making someone we have conflict with an enemy. But how do we actually learn and still be in contact?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in one of your writings, you mentioned this notion that the crisis that we have in the modern time is kind of likened in a way as the pathway for traditional rites of passage. In a way, like if we could actually meet the modern day crisis in this more relational way that you're speaking of, then we actually would have these traditional rites of passage, but in the modern perspective. And I really loved that because it does feel like, in a way, many of us are seeking something other, even those of us that are aware of the beauty of challenge and want it. In a way, many of us are so nostalgic and looking for some other version of what's happening that's a little more mystical. There's something in there that had the blood and the marrow, the realness that I think many of us are seeking, yet we're turning away for something a little shinier.
Right. And that's I think so related to spiritual bypass and cultural appropriation. And I need to attribute that wisdom to elder and recently deceased elder Malidoma Patrice. And I think it's in his book, The Healing Wisdom of Africa. And he comes from the Western Garan culture in Africa, but then was educated in the West and lived in the US for quite a bit in other places. But he really noticed how many Western folks like really wanted these like indigenous teachings. And we see that today, like everyone's going to like Peru or to, wherever, and they all have some indigenous teacher or whatever, and the practice and whatever it is. And not to say that's necessarily so wrong, but so many of the rites and initiations people are trying to do with things like whether it's ayahuasca or whatever folks are doing, it's actually, Malidoma Somé said, it's in our culture, it's all of these kind of modern day problems, which are our rites of passage. So whether it's coming out or breaking from a religious tradition, going through a divorce, having a near-death experience or the death of a loved one, surviving a community trauma, tragedy, like there's no shortage of spaces, occurrences in our everyday life that can lead us to these immense rites of passage. And in my work, I really focus on in the transformative learning domain, and is this term called disorienting dilemmas. And it's when we have some sort of experience that really basically blows our worldview because we can't kind of fit it in. And so we have to navigate, we have the opportunity to navigate that and expand our worldview. We also have the opportunity, such as a narcissism meme would be, to fit that experience in our already like cocooned worldview, but hopefully we're opening up. And these are the rites of passage. Have led many 8-day wilderness solos, which are amazing, but we can also just attend to like our everyday problems.
Yeah, it's like I had so many problems, but let me try to create a new one.
Right, I know, but I'm going to go into debt and quit my job and fly across the world to, it's like, why don't you just I've got an idea.
Well, Jeanine, I'm so thankful for your work. And as we close, is there anything current that you want to share, or something I haven't asked you about that's in your heart and mind?
Yeah, I feel like we've really covered it. I just want to express gratitude to you and gratitude to everyone who's listening to our conversation. And I just always want to just express gratitude to ancestors and all the beings of the places we inhabit, and just deep respect and honor. And I think something I find immensely important, because we are living in such it can be depressing and overwhelming and angering times, is to really remember to take the time to practice and embody the joyfulness of the moments like that we were talking about. And again, these don't require a credit card or a big footprint, but go outside, make yourself a cup of tea, call your mom, whatever these things are. And remembering that when we're suffering, so many of our personal problems that we see as individual problems are part of this wider system. So often just taking the time to attend to others and serve and show up and being in relationships is like the medicinal balm we actually need